Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Stanford Roundtable panelists and our moderator, Katie Couric.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. I feel like with my headset a little bit of a cross between Madonna and a Time Life operator. But don't worry, I'm not going to twerk today. Welcome to the 2013 Stanford Roundtable. I am so thrilled to be here with our esteemed panelists today. Obviously, it's wonderful to be in such a beautiful, spectacular school. Welcome students, welcome alumni who are coming home to Stanford. And after spending a few days here, I've decided I might very well move in with President Hennessy and his wife, Andrea. You okay with that, you guys? Okay, good. So this is, I think, a perfect setting for the topic of our conversation today, which, as you know, is happiness. Can we control our happiness? Abraham Lincoln said, most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. Is pursuing happiness, does it actually get in the way of achieving happiness? Well, Edith Wharton said, if only we'd stop trying to be happy, we could have a pretty good time. Are we happiness junkies? William Saroyan once said, the greatest happiness is knowing that you don't necessarily require happiness. So whether you believe happiness is a warm puppy, as Charles Schulz did, or happiness is a warm gun, as the Beatles sang, hopefully more of you think the former than the latter, we're going to explore what it means, why we're so desperately seeking it, how it shapes us as human beings, what's interfering with our ability to achieve it, and how we can create lives that are happy, but more importantly, meaningful. So I'd like to introduce our panel here today. First up is Firdos Dabar, who I call Firdos Dabam. He's an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford, specializing in the study of how stress affects immunity, health, and well-being. Dabar was the first to discover mechanisms by which short-term stress boosts the body's defenses. He's working to harness the good effects of stress to boost immunity during surgery, vaccination, and cancer treatment. And what makes Firdos happy? Well, being in nature makes him happy. Jennifer Acker is the General Atlantic Professor of Marketing at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. A social psychologist, her research spans time, money, and happiness. She co-authored the award-winning book, The Dragonfly Effect, Quick, Effective, Powerful Ways to Harness Social Media for Impact, and is the recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, Citibank Best Teacher Award, and George Robbins Best Teacher Award. Wow, you're a good teacher. What makes Jennifer happy is cuddling with her family while watching a movie on a Friday night. Next up, we have Sonia Lubomirsky. Sonia is a professor of psychology and director of the Positive Psychology Lab at the University of California, Riverside, where she studies, where she studies the biological and behavioral causes of happiness. She's the author of The How of Happiness, a book of psychological strategies to help people maximize their joy. Through her work, she strives to give people the tools to lead happier, more satisfying lives. Her idea of happiness is holding her 5-month-old baby daughter. So, welcome to Sonia. David Kelly is the founder of IDEO, which I mistakenly called IDEO earlier. He built the company that created many icons of the digital generation, the Donald W. Whittier Professor of Mechanical Engineering. He also led the creation of the groundbreaking D School at Stanford, the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. His passion is unlocking the creative potential of people and organizations so they can innovate routinely and find satisfaction and joy in their creative endeavors. He just released a book called Creative Confidence: Unleashing the Creative Potential Within Us All. His idea of happiness is driving around in his 1932 Ford. And finally, Ian Gottlieb is the David Starr Jordan Professor of Psychology, Director of the Stanford Mood and Anxiety Disorders Laboratory, and Chairman of the Department of Psychology. His research examines psychological and biological factors that place individuals at increased risk for depression, as well as his processes that are involved in recovering from this disorder. His grandchildren make him happy, as does golf. So welcome to all of you. Let's give them a big round of applause. So, classic underachievers here. We're going to start by asking you all to each give your specific definition of happiness. What would that be, Firdo?
So I would define happiness as a combination of pleasure as well as meaning. Pleasures are generally short-lasting, meaning can generally be long-lasting. And that, by meaning, I mean meaningfulness in your life. And what I also feel is an important component of happiness is harmony. And Mahatma Gandhi said it beautifully when he said that happiness is when what you think, say, and do are in harmony. And I think that brings authenticity and genuineness to happiness, which is an important component.
What about you, Jennifer?
I would say that happiness means feeling good. And so the way you might measure it is, in general, do you feel happy right now? Do you feel satisfied? Are you interested in what you're doing?
Sonia?
I think happiness has two components, and the first is a sense that your life is good, that you're progressing towards your life goals, and the second is the experience of positive emotions. And one of my favorite definitions of happiness is that you want to continue doing what you're doing.
David?
Yeah, I think happiness is that kind of feeling of being present and really being able to have fun and knowing what fun is for you. I also think it has to do with having a sense of the world and that you have a calling, that you're doing something of higher purpose and meaningful to you.
I think happiness is loving and believing that you're loved and finding meaning in what you're doing.
All good definitions. Sonia, you've been called the queen of happiness. I don't know if you like that or not, but let's start with you for a larger question. Did you know in the past few months, over 1,000 books about happiness were released on Amazon? 1,000 books, including Happy Money, Happy People Pills, and Happiness for Beginners. Apparently, there are 5,000 motivational speakers out there who are earning a collective $1 billion. So how and why has the search for happiness become such a cottage industry? What's going on here?
Wow. Great question. You were going to surprise me with that question. I think one of my answers is that in the US and in the West in particular, in a sense, we've achieved a level of comfort, not all of us, but many of us, that we have the luxury to focus on our happiness. When people are worrying about their basic needs being met, they're not going to think about, oh, am I happy? And now, again, we've achieved sort of a level of material comfort where we can think about, we can sort of indulge ourselves and like, oh, am I happy? And I think the research has helped too, that now there's a lot more research on happiness. Neuroscientists are studying happiness, economists are studying happiness, psychologists are studying happiness. We can measure happiness pretty well now. And the media is very interested in what the researchers are doing, and so that kind of feeds off itself, and it creates a sort of snowball effect. But some people think that there's too much of a preoccupation on happiness.
I mean, is there a fine line between happiness and narcissism?
Yeah, I think there's sort of maybe a fine line, and now there's some new research that shows that if you're pursuing happiness sort of too much, if you're too focused on it, and you're constantly asking yourself, like, am I happy yet? Am I happy yet? That can backfire and actually can make you less happy.
To build on Sonia's point, I think there's also a lot of data to show that suicide's on the increase, depression's on the increase, particularly in the West, and particularly for young people. And I think that's worrisome, right? We're looking at ourselves saying, what's going on? And so I think in combination with the inroads that science has made and in understanding the question of what actually drives our happiness versus what we think, I think that factor also plays a role in this cottage industry.
We're going to talk about depression in a minute with Ian, but just as a neuroscientist, what is the difference biochemically between a happy brain and an unhappy brain? Because I think through imaging, we're learning so much more than we ever knew before about brain chemistry.
Yeah, and we're learning more every day. I think it's always interesting to me to have an image, as you said, of a happy brain and a depressed brain. And for me, it's important to realize that these are, as you know, these are people. And so they can be in a happy state, they can be in a depressed state, and certainly brains change and influence people's emotions, absolutely. There's reward circuitry in our brain that distinguishes people when they're depressed from when they're not depressed, from when they're happy. We're actually trying to teach young children to change their brain circuitry, to alter their moods, to actually prevent episodes of depression.
Having said that, do we all, my late husband Jay used to say that I was born on a sunny day.
Yeah.
Are certain people hardwired for happiness? In other words, do we all have individual set points? And what determines that? Is it genetics? Is it brain chemistry? What?
So obviously everyone will have information about this. There are different, as you would say, set points. We used to call those traits, and people have different levels of friendliness, happiness, aggression, hostility. The notion of a set point for happiness is that you have a certain level, yours is very high, and sometimes you'll have events that are positive or negative, and you'll fluctuate around that set point, but basically return to that level. There's absolutely genetic influences for that, but the environment and your upbringing plays a huge role in determining where that set point, or what we would call homeostasis, would be.
I mean, there's a whole field of research called behavioral genetics, and what these scientists do is they compare how similar in happiness are identical twins to how similar in happiness are fraternal twins. And it turns out that identical twins are much more similar in their happiness levels, and that suggests that there is a large genetic component in happiness. But that doesn't mean that you're doomed or fated to be either happy or unhappy. So there's also a large component which is determined by what you do in your everyday life. Sort of happy people have certain habits. They tend to be more grateful. They tend to look on the bright side. They're more likely to exercise and meditate and focus on relationships and savor the moment. And so what my and other people's research is showing is that if you learn some of these habits that sort of these so-called happy people already have, you can raise your happiness as well.
Firdaus, I know let's talk a little bit more about the physiological underpinnings of happiness. It seems slightly counterintuitive, but stress is not necessarily an impediment to happiness. In fact, it can boost happiness, at least if it's good stress. Can you explain that?
Sure. So with modern research, we're beginning to look at stress as a spectrum of possibilities. At one end of the spectrum, you have good stress. So this is sort of more of the new research. And good stress is what Mother Nature gave you as your fight or flight stress response. The characteristic of good stress is that it's generally brief in nature, so specifically lasting for minutes to hours in duration. And it is this stressor, this type of stress response, that prepares you when you need protection. For example, if a predator is about to attack you, or in a modern medical context, if you're undergoing surgery. But it's also activated when you need to perform. So for example, you might find yourself on a roundtable panel with extremely distinguished guests and an esteemed audience, and you're sitting here going, my heart is pumping, I think the adrenaline's really going, but hopefully it helps you make sense of what you're about to say. The other interesting thing, thank you. The other interesting thing about this is that this same response biologically is engaged under conditions that involve pleasure. So people who love running, okay, they're loving it, but their biological stress response is on in full swing, the fight or flight response. And sexual intercourse, intensely pleasurable for most people, is one of the most potent activators of this response. So that's good stress. That's one end of your spectrum. At the other end of your spectrum, you have bad stress. These are typically stress responses that go on for long periods of time, weeks to months to years. And in between these two, you have this zone of low or no stress, which is where you want to be for most of the time. So what we find that happiness and other kinds of pro-social ways of existence help you do is stay on that good side of the stress spectrum. But what's interesting is that being on the good side of the stress spectrum makes conditions favorable for you to be happy, for you to be on the good side of your emotional spectrum. And so you have this positive feed-forward cascade that's set up, which in nature is a good thing. Just as it could be negative, it's also a good thing if you have one good thing stimulating another.
I'm a bit of a stress junkie. Does that keep me happy?
It probably does, as long as you have sufficient periods of downtime between your hits of stress, and then the stress hits are reasonably short in duration. But you know, the important thing is that it could also go the other way. So just as we said that happiness conditions can favor your staying on the healthy side of the stress spectrum, unhappiness, fear, chronic stress can also actually keep you in a negative cycle. And there's a beautiful quote by Yoda, if I may, in Star Wars, The Phantom Menace, where he's talking to little Anakin Skywalker, and he says, fear is the path to the dark side. So fear, in some ways, is a potent chronic stressor, potent bad stressor. Fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And this is profound in a way, because not only does it describe a negative feed-forward cycle, but it also says that these kinds of positive or negative emotions in this case can spread. So it goes beyond the person who's feeling them and can pervade the others around them.
When we were talking about negative stress last night, we talked about dealing with a terminal illness, caring for a sick loved one, having sort of that constant stress sort of day in and day out over an extended period of time. And David, it made me think about your situation, because you experienced a health ordeal where you had to sort of stare your own mortality in the face. And I'm curious how that might have changed your perspective on happiness, or how it affected you and your attitude.
Yeah, sure. I highly recommend being dosed with a terminal disease as long as you don't actually have one. You know.
Yeah.
It's It does kind of straighten you right up, you know, would be my take. But yes, so 2007, I was diagnosed with throat cancer, and they said, you got about a 40% chance to live, and you really start thinking, well, you start making like deals with God, even though you don't keep them eventually. What you really realize is your mortality, and it gets you really excited. If you're going to survive this thing, it gets you really excited about, focusing on what is fun for me. What was I put on earth to do? And to be honest, you pretty soon you become mostly irritated with the notion that you're going to die at all, rather than that you might die of this cancer. Like I was living my life like it was going to go on forever. And so it was a really cathartic thing. And, as the years went on, as the months went on, this lasted about a year, and I started to really focus on, what was my calling? What was I going to do of importance? And that really made me a lot happier to have, instead of just doing the things that are on my calendar that I have to do today. And you can fill your calendar up with, pretty interesting things, but they don't add up to a meaningful life. And so I was convinced that if I survived, that I was going to do something that was a really good fit for me. I have lots of students here, and that so many of them don't really have that notion. They're really kind of doing something for someone else. They're trying to please their parents, or they're going to get a job that looks good to society. But we try to help them, find something in life that feels good. Because I have plenty of friends who have lives that look good but feel bad. And so the cancer thing made me sure that I wanted a life that felt good inside.
And in fact, Jennifer, there's a big difference, isn't there, between a happy life and a meaningful life. And I almost sometimes hate the word happy, because it does seem sort of shallow and temporary in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a big issue with the word happiness. And partly because it means so many different things to different people. Even in the definitions that we all said, there was variance in what we said. And some of the definitions we talked about feeling good, and then other times it's really this, this idea of having a calling or feeling like you would want to do something forever. And so if you unpackage those two constructs and you kind of label them, not perfect labels, but happiness versus meaningfulness, you can start to kind of pull apart what does it mean to live just a happy life without meaning, and a meaningful life maybe with less happiness. And so some of my co-authors and I ran a large-scale study to start pulling apart these two things, even though they're very positively correlated. And one of the things we found is that, for example, David, when you went through that experience in 2007, that didn't feel happy, right? You didn't go through it and say, like, I feel good right now, but it felt meaningful, and it changed the way you made decisions subsequently. And that's one big difference between happiness and meaningfulness. Another big difference is people who report to have a happy but not necessarily meaningful life tend to self-report to be takers, like very self-oriented, kind of monitoring what comes to them. And individuals that report to have a very meaningful life tend to be much more other-oriented, giving to others, taking care of kids, taking care of others in need. And that notion of giving to others subsequently actually makes you happy in a way that's more longer-lasting.
So while reading about these things and thinking about them, what I couldn't quite understand is why it's not defined as a combination of, so happiness is not defined as a combination of pleasure and meaningfulness. And if you do that, then it sort of takes away the frivolity of happiness, if people begin to understand it that way. And then the other important thing to understand is that pleasure is not all bad. I mean, the other terms used for this is hedonia, which is the pleasure aspects, and eudaimonia, which is the meaningfulness aspects of happiness. And sometimes people sort of mistake it with sort of hedonism, which is like looking for pleasure's sake. And that's not what most people are talking about in terms of the pleasure that's a component of happiness. And then the other issue about happy people being takers and meaningful people, being givers. I was thinking about my kids' grandparents, all of them, and imagining many scenes where they're sort of sitting with the grandkids. And there is like tremendous happiness there, and there's a huge pleasure component, and there is no real taking, involved. So sometimes I think, like, because of the difficulty of grappling with some of these concepts, we may have a tendency to put maybe unwarranted negative associations, on them.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between talking about happiness versus meaning and pursuing happiness versus pursuing meaning. I think people who are sort of constantly sort of pursuing pleasure, pursuing hedonism, they have these sort of characteristics of takers. But when I study happiness, and we find that happier people are more likely to be givers, to be helpful, to be philanthropic, to be healthier, to have more fulfilling relationships. And so there are all these benefits to happiness. And think about the last time that you felt that you had meaning, or the last time that you felt like your life was purposeful, maybe right now. Did that feel good? I mean, that feels good. It feels good to have meaning. And the last time that you had a moment of pleasure, a burst of positive emotion, research shows that positive emotions have these downstream positive consequences. When you feel good, you might get an idea. You feel more creative. Your immune system is boosted. You're more approachable. You're more likable. You're more productive at work. So both happiness and meaning are really critical, and they're really intertwined.
And David, what is the role of creativity in happiness? Because I know that's what you foster every single day, and you see it really having a transformative quality in your students.
Yes, it's just exactly what Sonia was talking about. So when we see students who think of themselves from childhood as not being creative, like in ad agencies, there's the creative type, the creatives, and the non-creatives, and this is a really big problem in the world where we want to be put in those two separate categories. And we really, everything shows that everybody's wildly creative. They just have certain blocks that keep them from realizing that creative potential. But the wonderful thing is, if you've gone for a long time, by the time you get to college, if you kind of opted out of being creative when you were in the 4th grade, by the time you get to be a junior or senior in college, You've felt that way about yourself for a long time. But what happens, Jennifer teaches with me at the D School, what happens is that if you lead the students through a series of small successes that they are creative, right? You give them a simple problem, and they succeed at that, and they kind of surprise themselves. Oh, and then you give them a little more difficult problem, and they succeed at that. And pretty soon, by the end of that, they flip. They say, "Oh my God, I'm a creative person. I always wanted to be a creative person." They try to justify it biologically. They say, "I knew I was creative. My uncle was a dancer, you know." My mother was an architect, so it's like, but it's just hard to believe because it's been atrophied for so long that that's the case. But when they do that, when they flip to that feeling that they walk around in their body thinking of themselves as a creative experience, they report, and I interviewed 100 of them for this new book, and they report that it changes not just their vocation, not just the stuff they're doing at school, it changes a lot of things in their life. They take on more difficult problems. They have more, stick-to-itiveness. They just come up with better ideas. And so this feeling of being a creative person, this confidence in your creative ability, I just like being around them. They're happier people given that they now own that creativity.
Conversely, do you think that insecurity is one of the biggest factors? You talk about confidence bolstering happiness. Is insecurity one of the biggest factors in unhappiness?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have an expert here who can talk to us about this in a minute. But I noticed especially in industry, that people who are performing normally and they somehow get insecure, they're afraid the boss doesn't like them anymore, or something in their career happens and then they start to feel insecure, they just behave badly. I mean, they shoot themselves in the foot. They do things that they wouldn't normally do because of this driving insecurity. So my life experience would say insecurity is the opposite. Maybe depression is, but insecurity seems like certainly a large part of the opposite of confidence or happiness.
Ian, let me talk to you about this search for happiness, because it seems
I'm enjoying listening to this because it's just so different from my everyday life.
The more we search for it, though, the more elusive it seems to be. I'm just going to read a quote from Time magazine. Since 1972, only about 1/3 of Americans have described themselves as very happy. Since 2004, the share of Americans who have identified themselves as optimists has plummeted from 79% to 50%. More than 20% of us will suffer from a mood disorder at some point in our lifetimes, and more than 30% from an anxiety disorder. By the time we're 18 years old, 11% of us have been diagnosed with depression. So what is going on here? Are we more anxious and depressed than ever, and why is that the case?
So that's an easy and a hard question. The easy answer is yes. We are absolutely, there are higher rates of depression and anxiety. Every generation, in fact, is having higher rates of depression, and I feel like such a Grinch here in this happiness panel. But I spend my life trying to understand how to prevent unhappiness. And so we know that your numbers are actually low, I think, that those are underestimates of the rates of depression. They're increasing with every generation. The age of onset is getting younger and younger. So we have an unprecedented number of young children experiencing diagnosable episodes of depression at this point.
Why?
So the optimism, is the government open again? Are they not open? So is the optimism misplaced? Is it when you actually have it? Is it so the question of is optimism, what's the relation between optimism and realism? And does it matter? And is it better, people will argue that it's better to be optimistic independent of what the situation is. That will keep you healthier, better than being realistic, if there is such a thing. The why, there are lots of theories about why, but the fact is we don't know. That I believe that it's not that we're more aware of it. We were aware of it a generation ago. I don't think it's an artifact of diagnosis. I think that there are cohort effects. That is, every generation is feeling stressors that they feel are unique. You can't imagine what it was like to go through World War I or World War II. I mean, it doesn't feel like this should be any worse. And yet, you ask each generation, and it just seems the perception is the stress. But I have quotes from the 1800s about the pelting of telegrams and women having the vote, and can you imagine how stressful this is? Right.
Sonia, do you think that we perhaps set the happiness bar too high? Do we have an unrealistic expectation that somehow we should, maybe we even deserve to be happy all the time? And so we have a difficult time tolerating when we're not in a good mood.
Right. I mean, I think there's lots of sort of cultural and subcultural differences. And actually, I was a graduate student at Stanford, and I noticed that there was, I don't know if the alums agree with this, I thought there was sort of this norm or desirability to be happy and to show happiness. And there was closet unhappiness in the students, and they were hiding it. I don't know if that's still true, but I think there's certain kind of subcultures or groups where it's very desirable to be happy and to express happiness. That's not true everywhere. But our culture is so focused on happiness. I mean, why are we having this roundtable on happiness? And it's not on depression, it's on happiness. And as a happiness researcher, I mean, every single day I have journalists emailing me, asking me questions. I get hundreds of emails from just regular people asking about happiness. There's so much interest in it. Have we set the bar too high? I don't know. I mean, but I do want to stress that we shouldn't be happy all the time. I mean, our goal shouldn't always be about happiness. Negative emotions, as Firdaus suggested, also have their function, their value. I mean, sometimes we should be anxious in preparation for a job interview, or angry when we see injustice, or sad when there's a problem. It's just that when those emotions are chronic, that's when they're a problem. But I don't think we should be aiming to be happy all the time. And you get that sense, that people are like, I want to be happy all the time.
And in fact, taking bereavement out of the DSM is an indication that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be unhappy when you've experienced an enormous loss.
And it's not a psychiatric disorder.
Right.
Right. And just to clarify why that's so important, in April, 4 months ago, it was a psychiatric disorder. In May, when the new version of the diagnostic manual came out, it's gone. And it has changed. I mean, that happens all the time, of course, but it has. So our conception of what's normal, what's abnormal, what's a psychiatric disorder, what's a good thing to have, what's a bad thing to have, is changing, as it should, with the culture.
What about money? I mean, that's a very sort of obvious question, but does money buy you happiness? And I know the research is all over the place on that, Sonia, isn't it?
It's a very complicated question because money is related to happiness. Wealthier people are happier than less wealthy people, but the correlation is not as big as we think it is. So the one answer is that as long as your basic needs are met, more money doesn't make a huge difference. Of course, when you're poor, when you don't have, safety, good schools, shelter, food on your table, you're going to be very unhappy. But another answer to that question is that it's not money that makes you happy, it's how you spend it. So if you spend your money on philanthropy, on helping others, on taking your nephew to the zoo, on having experiences, on learning something, on traveling, on growth, on contributing to your community, that definitely makes people happy. And richer people, we gotta just admit this, acknowledge this, richer people are happier than people who have less money.
And in fact, Jennifer, when you buy things to impress other people, you derive less happiness. And I think one expert said a good litmus test is, would you engage in this experience if you could tell no one about it? So that really kind of, it's interesting, the correlation between buying either things or buying experiences and this whole notion of comparing yourself to other people.
Absolutely. We ran one study where we gave people a fictitious amount of money. It was say we give you $100, how would you spend it? And the individuals that decided to spend it on a thing versus an experience, like going out to dinner, and we followed up with them later on and said, how happy are you now? How happy are you generally? A myriad of other measures. The individuals that chose to spend it on an experience reported to be happier than the individuals that chose to spend it on an object. And yet our behavior, our choices that we make aren't always in line with what actually drives our happiness. So we don't seem to sort of record that and in day-to-day life make choices that are oftentimes misaligned with more lasting happiness.
Well, and we know there are different patterns of brain activity in reward centers when you're giving away rather than taking, right? So for lots of people.
Let's talk about the role of technology, because I think we are so tethered to our phones, so tethered to our iPads, our computers, whatever, and obviously distracted from being present in the here and now and actual face-to-face interaction. How is technology affecting our ability to be happy? That's a big question. Anybody can take it. David?
So, no, I can tell you a little thing. I have a colleague named Cliff Nass, who's a professor here at Stanford, and he just did a study about watching kids and seeing how well they could understand facial expressions of adults or other people, right? And he basically found that they're not watching as carefully as we are. I know as a kid, I'm sure I watched my mother very closely to know, just a little bit of a move of an eyebrow meant she was irritated, or that, should I run, or was she happy with me or whatever. And so those thousands and I'm not the scientists can probably actually tell you something. You just kind of, but my experience is that too. I have a 16-year-old daughter, which is that there's so few impressions comparatively about trying to see that kind of human interaction. I mean, they do things like come home from the dance early so they can text each other.
Yeah.
It's a little it was a little different in our days. But so I think technology is a wonderful thing. Look how it's connecting people, and maybe you're happier because you're better connected. That seems like it's possible. But I do think there is some damage in the lack of interpersonal connection.
It's because it keeps you from being empathic, right? I mean, from being able to read facial cues like your mom's, or, right? I mean, it can be it does connect us, but can also be extremely isolating, can it?
Absolutely. I mean, you start to see all of these people being happy, doing all of these, remarkable things without you. And that can create this feeling of, loneliness and disconnection, ironically.
Or FOMO, fear of missing out.
Absolutely.
Which my daughters say I have.
Yeah, which, Stanford students definitely feel. But I do want to put in one sort of plug for social media. I do think that, and technology more generally, when you do have a focused goal, when there's a goal of something that's bigger than yourself and showing how lucky you are or how glamorous you are, what party you're at, when you have a goal that's bigger than yourself and others share it and you have sort of an action plan of where you want to go with it, it's in those contexts that where you use technology that I do think it can bring about happiness, partly because it is so meaningful. And when you do something that's bigger than yourself and feels meaningful, that drives happiness.
And I also wanted to kind of add both a negative and a positive. And the negative is that a study I read recently showed that after people spend time on Facebook, their self-esteem drops a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's because
60% of respondents in a poll said they do not feel better about themselves after spending time on social media.
Because they're hearing about, I did this and I did that, all these positive things people are doing. But the positive comment is that if you are very shy, or if you have an unusual interest or a rare illness or condition, social media is wonderful for that, because it allows you to to get together sort of virtually with other people who are like you that you can't find in your day-to-day life. And again, if you're shy, anxious to interact in person, that can really be a lifesaver for some people. So there's many positives as well.
The flip side, it creates communities of pedophiles too.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a negative on that front as well. Rudos, what were you going to say?
Thanks for bringing
This
that
is
up.
happiness.
I know.
Oh, sorry, happiness. Happy.
Happiness.
I wanted to say something earlier that actually ties into this too, and that is that first of all, it's okay to be sad or to experience negative emotions for certain periods of time, right? That's natural. For stress as well as negative emotions, one of the most powerful buffers, one of the most powerful protectors is genuine social support. If you have even one or two people that you could count on, that you know who truly care for you, it can buffer many of these negative effects, both psychologically and biologically, tremendously, right? So social support, in a way, is one of the biggest sort of factors that we have that could be harnessed positively. And what I have often wondered is whether the power of social media, so Facebook, Twitter, Google, everything that technology has, made possible for us in bringing about this connectedness, how could that power actually be harnessed to transfer these kinds of pro-social supportive behaviors? And I've wondered why, just as the negative things are enabled, by these technologies, what could one do that would actually enable this positive, aspects to happen? And again, the key is that it should be genuine. It doesn't have to be 600 friends. It could be just one or two, but as long as the interaction is genuine. And that's the other aspect to some of the questions that you were asking earlier, is that maybe one of the things that might help many of us is if young people as well as older people begin to realize that the key elements of being happy are not just seeking pleasure, but also adding meaning to your life. However little or large you can do that. And then the other is authenticity, because when what you think, say, and do are in harmony, like Gandhi said, you know that to yourself, and you know the difference. So you can pretend to be happy on Facebook, but if everybody sort of reduce the gap between pretending to what they really feel, then maybe the better outcomes could start spreading.
Let's talk about children, because there are a lot of parents here today, also a lot of students who probably want to have children one day. And the research seems to be somewhat in conflict about if parents are happier than those who have no children. And Sonia, what is sort of the bottom line on that?
Wow, it's a hard question, right? So does having children make you happy? Are parents happier? My colleagues and I did several studies where we showed that parents are a little happier than people who don't have kids, but more important, they say that they have more meaning. So, we don't really, when we decide to have children, we usually think, well, I want to have a child because it's going to make me happy, but really, the purpose of children is not to make us happy. They're going to go off and be their own person. But parents do say that they have more meaning. And when we ask people what they want for their children, interestingly, most people say, I want my children to be happy. So we can sort of talk about that as well. I wanted to mention this cool study we just did in Vancouver with kids, where we asked children to do acts of kindness. We asked them to do 3 acts of kindness a week. Little things. They said, I vacuumed the floor, I hugged my mom after she came back from work stressed out. And the kids who did acts of kindness for 4 weeks got happier. This is sort of talking about kind of how generosity and pursuing meaning can make people happy. But not only did they get happier, they became more popular with their classmates. So generosity doesn't just make you feel good. You want to be around other people who are helpful. And we thought that was great.
Yeah. Let's talk about our kids, because I'm wondering, there's been so much written about overparenting and about the fact that parents have a difficult time parents these days, and I include myself in this category, we have a difficult time allowing our kids to fail, allowing them to experience discomfort. And as a result, they're not learning the tools of resilience, which they'll need throughout their lives to deal with disappointments and setbacks. So do you think we're doing our kids a disservice by protecting them from unhappiness?
Yes.
Yes. I think there's simply no question if that's what we end up doing. I think we don't mean to do that when we're trying to protect our children. We're doing it because we believe it's in their best interest to do that. But we need those skills. We need to learn how to cope with failure. We need to learn how to cope with adversity. It's the only way that we're going to do better, to grow, to become resilient, which is really defined as doing well in the face of stress. When you probably shouldn't be doing well, you are. And why is that? But if you don't learn those skills because you have a parent or guardian who's with all the best intentions being too protective, then it's not doing any favors to the children.
Why are we doing it? Why are parents so over the top, either helicopter parents or just can't tolerate seeing their kids sad or unhappy? What's going on there, Sonia?
I don't know.
Are you like that?
I don't know. I mean, there was sort of this self-esteem movement, which I thought was over, and that was when we thought that it was good to always praise children and give them awards. And still, like in Little League, I mean, they all get trophies. You know, everybody wins. So, you know, but I think that's a Western kind of U.S. thing, this child centrism. We know that in Europe and in Asia, parents aren't so kind of, their lives aren't centered on their children. We have this sort of hyper-parenting here that you're supposed to go to every single Little League game. I mean, I have 4 kids. I can't go to all the games. You have to go to every single Little League game and every, practice and concert and help with homework every day. I don't think that's doing our kids a service. And you go to school and the kids bring their little projects, their art projects that are all clearly made by the parent. They're like professionally made, like little thing, and how is that helping our children when we do their homework for them? So yeah, I'm all against that, but I don't know why. But I think it's a very Western and even maybe like a very U.S. kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't have any data to address this either, but I do think that the original question, which is, I just want my kid to be happy, I think that's been on the increase, especially in Western cultures, over the last few decades. And I think implicitly when you tell yourself, I just want my child to be happy, that has an impact on how parents parent and also on the expectations of the children. Like, I should be happy all of the time. And I'd be curious, I think, to create an experiment where parents say to themselves, I just want my child to have a meaningful life. How would they make decisions in very different ways, and how might they raise their kids in different ways, and also what might be the expectations of the children of, always being happy.
And in fact, you were telling me you moved to New York partially because you wanted to make your kids uncomfortable.
Yeah. I'm not... I hope my kids aren't watching this right now, but yeah, I mean, the idea here was that, you get in your life and you're trying to make your children happy, and they get on this league and the next league, and you're in that path, and you rarely kind of look up and go, what would actually be meaningful? What would they remember 10 years from now? What would they remember from 20 years from now? And the answer to that question is also often like physical dislocation, displacement from where you are. And one of the big reasons is because you're going to experience conflict. You're not going to have friends for a little while. All of your friends are back home. You're going to have to navigate a new world. And in that process, that's where meaning is extracted.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. It seems like the psychological equivalent of not letting your kid play on the playground, right? Because they might hurt themselves, right? Or in the jungle gym. Psychologically, you're kind of protecting them, from doing things that they'll learn from. It's like I can remember when my daughter was very young, and she was very afraid of this slide, and she kind of would fall down the steps a little bit and stuff, and I really wanted to just carry her to the top and put her on the top of the slide. But she eventually got the courage, and on her own, with me kind of, hiding my eyes, she climbed all the way up, and then she slid down. Well, the confidence gained, you couldn't keep her off that slide, for the next weak, but I mean, it's the same thing psychologically as we protect our kids from, from them actually, failing and being judged for it and like learning from that.
Have you seen sort of overparenting manifest itself in millennials? I know that some college administrators refer to students these days as teacups because they're so emotionally fragile.
Yeah.
Sorry. And I'm just curious, have you witnessed that with your students at all?
No, I don't notice my students any more fragile than they were, a generation ago. In any way, they are looking for. I mean, I guess I don't know if this is even relevant. I mean, but they are more they're more interested in doing something that has social value, right? That's the thing that's most obvious, and I'm very proud of that generation.
Which is
right?
a good thing, yeah. Some scientists say, let's talk about sort of the continuum and how happiness changes through your lifespan. And Jennifer, scientists say people are unhappiest at middle age. Is that true? And how does happiness change or fluctuate with your life cycle?
Yeah, I think the least happy people are, age 45 with 4 kids or 3 kids and female. So. I don't know what that says for Sonia and I, but there is data to show that we start out relatively happy, and again, we haven't gotten really into the measurement of happy, but this is pretty robust across different measurements, and then you decline around sort of that 30 to 45, and it doesn't really pick up until 50, and it starts to increase all the way to 70, and there's lots of potential reasons for it. For the 70-year-olds in the house, I'm sure you're smiling right now. And one set of, I guess I should say that we also have another line of research that the meaning of happiness also
Right.
shifts. And so it's not just this absolute level. It's
Well,
also
what you consider happiness.
Exactly. So we'll ask people, what do you consider to be happy? And you'll do a semantic analysis. And what we're seeing is that the meaning of happiness shifts in very systematic ways over the life course every few years. And so it starts out with excitement. So happiness is associated with excitement for the 18 to 20-year-olds. And that's where they're discovering their new goals. And then it shifts to kind of, I think someone said on the film, happiness feels satisfaction, or I feel productive, and that's when you move to the pursuit of your goals, and so when you accomplish them, you feel satisfied, and then you move to balance, where you're trying to juggle multiple goals in your life, and there the meaning of happiness does have to do more with alignment and meaningfulness, and then you move to kind of savoring what you've created in your life and being more present-oriented, and then the meaning of happiness shifts to contentment, which is a qualitatively different type of happiness. And so when we're pursuing happiness, just to your point of, one of the difficulties about that is that the meaning of happiness is constantly shifting.
Do you think that trying to harken back to sort of that euphoric, hyperkinetic happiness of your youth is one of the reasons marriages end or people leave their spouses?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done any research on this myself, but I do think that people reflect back to the excitement that they felt when they met someone, and the fact that it's not there anymore. They sort of look at their partner and they say, what's this about? Rather than necessarily potentially thinking their own meaning of happiness has potentially shifted or could shift.
There's a phenomenon called hedonic adaptation, and this is a very natural phenomena that happens that when people just get used to or adapt to positive changes in their lives. So when we first fall in love, we get married, we have this honeymoon effect, and then after a while, you can't sustain that passion forever.
And in fact, doesn't it pretty much dissipate? Helen Fisher, the anthropologist, said it dissipates after 18 months, which is such a bummer.
2 years. 2 years.
2 years.
2 years. On average, yeah. On
I
average,
feel so much better.
but it's interesting. On average, it dissipates in 2 years, but that means that some people get unhappy very quickly. Others maintain their happiness for much longer, and that's also true for new jobs, moving into a new house, having children. And so we adapt. We adapt to almost everything positive that happens in our lives. And we have to understand that this is very natural. This is very normal. I think some people, they're constantly moving jobs. Like we know in Silicon Valley, there are people who are just, every 2 years, they're moving to a new, like something even better. There's always something better. Or they move to new relationships, or they keep upgrading cars. Or we're doing a study of people who upgrade smartphones, right? It's like, you're never satisfied. You always want more. And there's an adaptive component. You can argue that human beings would never really make progress if we were just satisfied with the status quo. We always want more and more, but there's a hedonic cost to that, right? There's a downside to that. And so that we're never satisfied for very long.
Having said that, you do need some forward-looking behavior and goal-oriented behavior to sustain happiness, right? That's what they say. You have to have a positive view of the past, but also a promising view of the future, right?
That's right. And always pursuing goals. We talked about the importance of goal pursuit, that happy people are people who always have a project. They always are looking to something new around the corner. They're pursuing meaningful life goals, no matter what their age or whether they work or whether they stay at home. Having goals is really critical to
And
happiness.
that's why when people retire, they're not necessarily that happy just playing golf, Ian.
Really? Because I was really looking forward to this.
Let me ask you about this World Happiness Report. It was published by the Earth Institute of Columbia University. According to this report, the U.S. ranks 23rd on a 50-country happiness index, far behind number 1, wait for it, Iceland. Who knew? Number 2, New Zealand. Number 3, there's some Kiwis over there. You don't have to cheer for your country necessarily. Number 3, Denmark. The U.S. trails Singapore, Malaysia, Tanzania, and Vietnam. Why do you think that's the case? Does anyone have any insight into that?
It might be, and hopefully discussions like this will help, and I really mean this. It might be because here we pay the least attention to the meaningfulness component of happiness. And so when you define it as being pleasure and hedonic, and then go down the stumbling paths that many of us have talked about, I think it sets the stage, and it's an unfair deal for the happiness concept, because what all the research shows is that meaningfulness is a critical component of happiness, and in fact a huge generator of sort of positive effects on health, performance, creativity, and everything. And it may be that just not capturing this aspect of happiness and defining it in a narrow kind of just halfway definition is part of what the problem is. Because if you don't think of it that way, when people ask you, are you happy? You might say no. Or you're constantly thinking, I will be happy when I buy that fancy new car and house. I will be happy if I design the next greatest thing after the iPhone, which is especially relevant here. Or I will be happy when my kid goes to Stanford, which actually is true. By the way. You're forgetting the meaning part. And maybe that's part of the bringing meaningfulness, the importance of meaningfulness into the happiness concept could do a lot of good. Because just that awareness may then help people say, oh, okay, actually, I'm not missing, out in my life.
Icelanders are shallow.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, you think people in Iceland and New Zealand are shallow? That it's
No,
just
so
a
I
definition?
think, so that's an important point. Maybe, I don't know this for sure, but maybe, and maybe the Kiwi there could tell us, but maybe their cultures are such that meaningfulness is part of their definition and feeling of happiness. So when people in Iceland or New Zealand or Denmark are asked whether they're happy, they're taking into account the meaningfulness of their lives, which not only helps them report happiness better, but maybe it helps them decide the actions and decisions that they're taking as they live their lives.
Well, I think there are a few answers to the question of sort of why different nations are different in happiness. I mean, one is wealth, the GDP, and not just wealth, but democracy, egalitarianism, good sort of social welfare. You'll notice that the countries that do well are doing well, economically, and they have just pretty good distribution of wealth, better than we do. And the other answer is really social capital and social support and community. I mean, the countries that are happier have good social support. When you ask people, do you have people who you trust, who you can rely on? One study that I just heard about, I thought that was so interesting, showed that the poorest countries were the least happy, but had the most meaning. And you thought, well, how could that be? How could how people in poor countries have the most meaning? And it turned out it was religion. It was that they were the most religious countries, and people who are religious tend to report more meaning. So there's all these different factors. There's religion, there's social capital, there's GDP. They all kind of work together.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, I was just going to add on another level. I think in the United States right now, we're experiencing a significant time famine relative to other cultures. And that's this feeling that time is scarce and I don't have enough time. There was a recent study done with over 1,000 people where 50% of the sample reported that they didn't have enough time in the day. And there are cross-cultural differences in that feeling that I don't have enough time. And there's lots of research to show that when you don't feel like you have enough time, stress increases, the sustained level of stress, and that can drive unhappiness.
At the same time, though, I think we live in a culture where busy is used as a badge of honor. I'm so busy. I've got so much on my plate. And people almost brag about it. So I think we have a very kind of a mixed opinion, and we're very conflicted about this whole notion of time, aren't we?
Absolutely. Then we take pictures of us being really busy, and telling everyone how busy we are.
Well, we're going to give people sort of some take-home information that hopefully, or a takeaway message from this panel. And having talked about this and thought about it in advance of this panel as well, what do you think are the most important ingredients for a happy life? What would you say? Obviously, meaning and being a giver rather than a taker. But what other things? You were saying a support system.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a support system and the feeling, as much as one can, it doesn't have to be all the time, that your actions are likely to be meaningful for people around you. And sleep.
Sleep, yes.
Really.
And in fact, maybe I should broach it a different way, because I know you have some specific recommendations. How can we improve our level of happiness? I know sleep, you say, is critically important and underrated.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
It seems like from different angles of research in the biomedical sciences, the psychological sciences, that sleep may be one of our biggest restorative factors that we have. When talking about this in another setting, I would say it's sleep, nutrition, exercise in that order, plus a few more, including living a life that's genuinely sort of compassionate and caring. All these factors set your psychology and physiology in a mode that either maintains health, if you're healthy, or restores it if you're fighting a disease. And sleep appears to be a critical factor because many aspects of building resilience or build back in both brain, mind, and body occur during that time. And sadly, that's one of the things that we all, me included, and I know actually all of us, because we were emailing last night till God knows how late, sacrifice. And it's worth thinking about trying to get as much of it back as one can, without being worried about it. If you have to pull an all-nighter or two, or if there are times when you have a tough time getting sleep, that's okay, as long as it's not just constant and forever.
Mm-hmm. What would you recommend, Sonia?
The way I like to think about the critical ingredients of happiness are there three. One is having a sense of control in your life. And I think we're lucky in Western cultures to have a sense of control and autonomy in our daily lives. Control. The second is personal growth. Anything we can do to help us grow as a person, to learn, to have new experiences. And the third is having to do with relationships, connecting with others and contributing to our communities. So autonomy, control, relationships, and growth, I think, are the three critical components of happiness and how to improve happiness.
We hear so much about gratitude, and I know you have sort of mixed feelings about that, Sonia, a little bit. I mean, I think you appreciate that we need to be grateful for what we have, but some of it you think is a little hokey, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. So I've been studying gratitude for many, many years, and you know, it does sound hokey, and there are people who are like, oh, they tell you, you should count your blessings, you should be grateful. And I've always found that to be kind of trite and hokey. On the other hand, there's all this research that shows that when we truly appreciate what we have, when we're grateful to the people in our lives, it makes us feel more humble, it makes us feel happier, it makes us feel more connected. So we find, for example, that when you write a gratitude letter to a person in your life who's been good to you, it raises humility because it makes you realize that, you know, your success is not just because of you. You're standing on the shoulders of giants and people who have helped you. It makes you feel more connected to that person, and it makes you happier. So lots and lots of research shows that trying to be more grateful and appreciate makes you happier. It also gets back to what we were talking about before, about hedonic adaptation. We tend to get used to and take for granted almost everything positive in our lives, including your kid getting into Stanford, right? At first, you're thrilled, and then you kind of get used to it, and then you worry about your dishwasher breaking, you know? And so appreciating what you have is actually a direct way to combat adaptation, right? To really try to appreciate your spouse, your new home, your car, your smartphone, whatever, that will help you really enjoy and savor the things that you do have, so you don't focus so much on what you don't have and on wanting more of what you don't have.
It does seem that, at least to me, that the kind of negative stuff coming towards you sticks more easily, and that positive thing. And so it seems that one of the keys to happiness is to be present and mindful when something good is happening. I had a colleague get really upset with me. We were teaching together, and the teaching evaluations came back, and there were 50 of them, and 48 of them were glowing, and 2 kids had a lot of negative things to say. Well, both of us kind of remembered the 2 negative critiques and forgot that 48 of them said lovely things. And so I think this is the kind of celebrating that when positive things are happening, like, be there for them to stick with you. Seems like it's important to me.
Can a positive mindset change sort of your happiness quotient, Ian? I mean, obviously, when it comes to clinical depression, not
Thank you.
necessarily,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But do you have sort of through meditation or through affirmations or through mental exercise, does the brain have the capacity to improve and elevate mood?
Yes, absolutely, without question. We have, long before we were able to image the brain and see what's happening in real time, we've had cognitive therapies that try to change your thoughts for anxiety, for depression, that are still today the most effective forms of treatment for unhappiness. And we know now what they're doing in the brain and how they're changing that. And this old power of positive thinking is real. I mean, we can now refine it where we couldn't before. We can hone it to make it more effective. But changing the way one thinks is the bedrock of probably the most effective form of treatment for emotional disorders.
And Jennifer, what about you? What do you think what are the ways you would recommend everyone leaving here today to sort of enhance perhaps their happiness, but also their purpose or the meaningfulness in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to do is really think about how you're spending your time. And so much work has been done around money and happiness and how you're spending your money and saving your money, but we don't do as much work in thinking around how do we really spend the day. We kind of just go through the day and we try and get our to-dos done, and then you end up in the day and you hopefully get a good night's rest. And I think we get on this treadmill without really thinking about how we're spending our time, what experiences are being cultivated. Are you really present with the people who are with you? And what is the nature of the relationships that you're cultivating? Who needs a little bit more attention? Who doesn't? And are you really giving to others?
I think, I fully agree with that. And I also think that authenticity is key. Authenticity and genuineness are key. And the more one has that, and the more one has that sort of internal and external resonance, the probability of good things happening for mind and body is increased. The other is that everybody has tough times, and the key is to sort of quickly recognize when you're experiencing tough times, and then humbly request and very genuinely, gratefully accept help from others. And when you're in a good position to be giving that help, just give it generously. And I think these are relatively simple things, but if authentically and genuinely practiced, can make a big difference, including, in performance and biology and health.
Any other closing thoughts from any of you? You all talked out. Go ahead, Sonia.
Well, I think, so generosity is really important. Lots of research shows that when we're kind to others, when we're thoughtful to others, not only does it make other people happy, it makes us happy. And then, positive thinking, again, it's hokey, and I don't want to say we should all just think positively all the time, but it is critical to happiness when we're optimistic. That might create a self-fulfilling prophecy where, if we're going on a job interview or want to ask someone out on a date, if we're more positive, optimistic, we're more likely to have success, and it makes us happier. So even though it's kind of hokey, I would say that positive thinking is also important.
I also think developing deep, meaningful relationships with people. I don't know about you all, but when I go to funerals and I hear people deliver eulogies about the person who's passed away, I always regret not knowing certain things about that person. And I always kick myself and think, why didn't I take the time to get to know that person better? And why was our relationship so superficial? That's, I think, is something that I've learned as I've gotten older.
There's an exercise that we can all do. We actually just finished a study where we asked people to live your life as though you're moving away, far away, in a month. So you're not dying, but you're not going to be here anymore. So in 30 days. And so we asked people to do this. And so what happened was, it was amazing. During those 30 days, we found people were spending much more time with their family and friends, really savoring that time, getting to know them better, going to that familiar place or restaurant or favorite place that they like to go to. And so that's kind of the key, right? To sort of live your life like it's your last day, your last month. It's really, really hard to maintain that because we're so busy, right? But that's something that we could all strive to do.
And that's exactly what older people do, right? I mean, we know that
right.
Older people have much more positive emotional functioning than younger people. And meaning becomes much more important than seeking new information and making new friends.
So we could all, go ahead.
One of the things we've done now that's been impactful is, you're in meetings all the day, one meeting after another, and one of the things we do at every meeting is we check in. We go around the room and have every person say what's going on in their life. I mean, as personal as they can make it. That makes that breaks down, that makes for a better relationship with the people. Not just that we're going to have this kind of business meeting, but you also that they're stressed about something in their life, or this is a particularly good day or bad day, or they're going on there. I mean, so that, it makes it more like like what real friends would do compared to what you'd normally do in a meeting. And I really believe that building those friendships and relationships is the key to this really feeling good about yourself and about your life.
Finally, do you think that the Declaration of Independence should have included the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaning rather than the pursuit of happiness?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant writer, so I don't want to.
You're not going to rewrite the Declaration of Independence.
But, they didn't even mean happiness the way we're talking about happiness. I believe they were talking about material happiness. That's what I've read. The historians say. So there.
As a graduate of the University of Virginia, I'm going to have to dispute that he was talking about material things. Firdaus, Jennifer, Sonia, David, Ian, thank you all so very much for participating today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I think we stand and hug it out.